I've hunted elk for 20 years. What I saw through that scope that morning was not one of them. I've been hunting elk in the Pacific Northwest since I was 16 years old. I know how they move, how they sound, how they behave when they're relaxed, and how they behave when they're not. I've been hunting in this forest more times than I can remember. What I saw that morning did not belong in it. It was a Thursday in late October, overcast and cold, the kind of morning that's perfect for elk. I was working through a section of the old growth about 3 miles from my truck, moving slowly and staying downwind. Around 7:30, I spotted something through the trees about 100 yards out. It was an elk, standing in a small opening between the firs. I stopped and watched it. It was standing completely still, which wasn't unusual at first. Elk freeze when they sense something, but this was different. It wasn't the tense, coiled stillness of a spooked animal ready to bolt. It was something flatter than that, more absolute, like a photograph of an elk rather than an actual living one. I raised my rifle and looked through the scope. The proportions were wrong, subtle enough that I couldn't have named it immediately, but wrong in a way that something in the back of your brain registers before the rest of you catches up. The legs were slightly too long. The neck sat at an angle that didn't look right, and still it hadn't moved. Not once. No ear flick, no visible breath in the cold air, no shift of weight, nothing at all. Then it turned its head and looked directly at me, not toward me, not in my general direction, directly at me, eye to eye through the scope, with a precision that made my stomach drop completely. Animals don't do that. They might look toward a sound or a movement, but they don't find the glass. I lowered the rifle slowly. When I looked back up, it was gone. No sound of movement, no crashing through the brush that you always hear when elk spook, just gone. I stood there for a moment, then decided I was done for the day. I turned and started back toward my truck on the small trail I'd come in on. I found them about a mile from where I'd parked, my own boot print from this morning pressed into the soft ground, heading in the opposite direction, and alongside them, matching my exact stride for at least a quarter mile of trail, the prints of something walking on 2 legs, right next to me. They weren't boot prints. They also weren't bare human feet, just 2 points of contact, deep and evenly spaced, walking right beside me the entire way in without me ever hearing a sound. I've told this story to 2 other people in my life. Both of them hunted that forest. Neither of them hunts it anymore. Neither of them explained why, and I didn't push it. I haven't been back either. Some things you don't need a full explanation for. Sometimes the tracks are enough. The front door was shut and deadbolted when we went to sleep. In the morning, it was wide open. Joel and I rented a cabin for a long weekend in early November. It was remote, it didn't have any neighbors, and it was backed up against a forest on 3 sides. Exactly what we wanted. The first night we were sitting by the fire when I noticed something at the window. It was a deer, standing just outside in the dark, looking in through the glass. It was so still and so close that it took me a moment to register what I was actually seeing. We watched it for a minute, then it turned and walked back into the trees. We talked about it over dinner, and we agreed it was unusual but not alarming, probably drawn to the light. The second night it was back, the same window, at the same time, around 9:30. It had the same absolute stillness again. Joel went to the window to get a closer look, and it held its position until he was about 3 feet from the glass before it stepped back into the dark. The third night, the same thing happened, with the same deer. I could see the notch in its left ear clearly now. On the 4th night, Joel decided to go outside. I stayed at the window, and I watched him cross the porch and step into the yard toward it. The deer did not move. It watched him approach with the same unnatural stillness it always had, not the wariness of a wild animal being approached by a person. It was just completely still and patient. Joel got about 15 feet from it, and then he stopped walking. He stood there for a moment, and then he turned around and came back inside and locked the door behind him. He didn't say anything immediately. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with his back to me. When he turned around, he looked terrified. "Its eyes are in the front," he said. Not the wide-set peripheral eyes of a deer. They were forward-facing eyes, like human eyes, looking out of a deer's face. We went to bed with every door locked and every curtain closed, and neither of us slept much. In the morning, I opened the bedroom door and found the front door standing wide open. The deadbolt was unlocked. Every window in the cabin had been pressed against from the outside. The smears and the condensation on the glass were large. The finger impressions were too long and too widely spaced to be human hands. We packed in 20 minutes and drove without even eating breakfast. I've looked up deer anatomy enough times since then to know that no deer has forward-facing eyes. I know what I saw through the window, and I know what Joel described when he came back inside. We haven't rented another cabin since that weekend, and we probably won't again. Whatever it was, it came back every single night until the last night when we stopped watching from inside and someone went out to meet it. And when that happened, it stopped performing and showed us what it actually was. I think about that a lot, about the patience of something that comes to the window 4 nights in a row, waiting to be approached, and what it might have done if we had stayed a 5th night. The dog kept perfect pace with me through the trees for 3 miles. When I finally got a clear view of it, I realized that it was not a dog. I run the ridge trail above the valley 3 or 4 mornings a week. It's an out and back, about 8 miles total, with a good elevation and a clear view of the slope below the ridge on the eastern side. I've run it probably 300 times. I know every section of it pretty well. It was an early Tuesday in September, just after 6 a.m. Still dim enough that I had my headlamp on for the first mile. About 2 miles in, I caught movement in the trees below the ridge line. Something large moving through the undergrowth parallel to the trail. My first thought was a dog. The size was right and the movement had that loose quality of a large breed running at an easy pace. I assumed it belonged to another early morning hiker somewhere on the lower trail, and I didn't think much of it. Then I stopped to check my watch. The movement below stopped too. I started running again, and it started moving again immediately. No delay, matching my pace through the brush without a sound. I sped up, and it sped up. I slowed to a walk, and it did the same. For the next mile, it stayed with me through the dense undergrowth below the ridge, never closing the distance, never falling back, never making the noise that any animal moving through that terrain should make. I told myself it was just a dog. I kept telling myself that. About a mile further, the trail curves around a rocky outcrop, and for about 200 yards, the slope below is completely open. There's no tree cover, and it's fully visible from the ridge. I came around that curve and looked down the slope immediately. It wasn't a dog. A man was standing in the trees at the far edge of an open section, perfectly still, looking up at the ridge. He was staring at me. He was holding something at his side. I couldn't make out what it was from that distance. I just ran. I didn't think about it. I didn't even look back. I didn't stop. I covered the remaining 4 miles back to the trailhead faster than I have ever run anything in my life. When I came out of the trailhead into the parking lot, I stopped. There was a truck parked directly beside my car. It hadn't been there when I arrived. The lot has 1 entrance and 1 exit. I'd been on that trail the entire time. There was no other road in, and I didn't see anyone else other than him. I got in my car and left without looking at the truck. I drove straight home and sat in my driveway for a while before I went inside. I mapped out the timeline later that evening. Even if he had turned around the moment I had saw him on the slope and run full speed back to the trailhead, he could not have reached the parking lot before me. Not by the trail, not through that terrain. I still don't have an explanation for that part. I don't run that trail anymore.